A young man had 15 million in his hands, but couldn't spend a single naira to save his dying mother. What he chose next destroyed his entire life. In the village of Elowen, there lived a young man named Silas. Silas was a scholar of great brilliance, a boy whose mind was as sharp as a new blade, yet his pockets were as empty as a dried-up well. He lived in a small hut made of mud and hope with his mother, Mara, and his little sister, Lyra. Every morning, Silas would walk to the village square, carrying a small wooden table. He worked as a messenger, counting coins for traders and writing letters for those who could not read. He was a first-class mind trapped in a third-class world. Despite his education, the village looked at him with pity or, worse, with mockery. The rich traders would toss their heavy bags at his feet, letting the dust settle on his only good shirt. Silas swallowed his pride like a bitter seed, because he knew that every copper he earned went toward his mother's medicine. Mara was fading. Her breath was like the rustling of dry leaves, and the healers demanded a price Silas could not pay. He was a giant in chains waiting for a key. One Tuesday, the sun was a red eye staring down at the market. Silas stood by his table, his back aching from hours of leaning over ledgers. A wealthy woman, draped in silks that shimmered like a snake's skin, stepped toward him. She wanted him to count her earnings from the spice trade. As Silas reached out to take her heavy purse, his fingers accidentally brushed against her gold-laden wrist. The woman let out a scream, as if she'd been bitten by a dog. Without a word of warning, she raised her hand and delivered a stinging slap across Silas's face. The sound cracked through the market like a whip. "How dare a common beggar touch me?" she shrieked, her eyes full of fire. "Do you know how much this silk costs? Your entire life is not worth the thread on my sleeve." The market went silent. Silas felt the heat of the slap rising in his cheek, but the coldness in his heart was much worse. He looked at the ground, seeing his own reflection in a muddy puddle. He was a graduate, a man of learning, yet he was being treated like a stray beast in the dirt. He realized then that being good had brought him nothing but pain. Humiliated and trembling, Silas packed his wooden table and began the long walk home. His mind was a storm of dark thoughts. When he reached their small hut, the smell of sickness greeted him. Lyra sat by the doorway, her eyes red from weeping. She told him that the village healer had come again and delivered a final warning. If they did not pay for the rare mountain herbs by the next moon, their mother would sleep and never wake up. Silas went to his mother's bedside. Mara looked so small beneath the tattered blankets. She reached for his hand, her touch cold and frail. "Do not worry, my son," she whispered, her voice a ghost of itself. "A clean heart is better than a full belly." Silas nodded, but inside, he was screaming. He looked at his sister, who was thin from hunger, and then at his mother, who was dying for lack of paper money. That night, Silas sat outside under the stars. He thought of his classmates who had traveled to the big cities and returned with shiny carriages and fine clothes. He wondered what they had found that he had not. The weight of his family's survival was a mountain on his chest, and the mountain was starting to crumble. The next morning, a black carriage pulled into the village, kicking up clouds of red dust. Out stepped a man named Julian. Silas's heart skipped a beat. He recognized Julian from their university days. Back then, Julian was the boy who failed his exams and spent his time chasing shadows. Now, Julian wore boots made of fine leather and a watch that glittered like a captured star. Julian saw Silas standing by the road and let out a loud, booming laugh. "Silas, the genius of our class. Why are you still standing in the dust?" Julian's voice was friendly, but his eyes were guarded and deep. He invited Silas to sit with him in a nearby garden. As they spoke, Julian spoke of vast lands he owned and businesses that never slept. Silas, desperate and broken, confessed his troubles. He spoke of the slap in the market, the mountain of debt, and the shadow of death hanging over his mother. Julian listened intently, swirling a drink in a glass cup. "You have a bright star, Silas," Julian said softly. "But you are trying to light the world with a candle. I know a place where the light is eternal and the gold flows like water. But you must be brave. The path is narrow. Silas looked at his friend, feeling a mixture of hope and fear. Is it a job, Julian? I will work day and night. I will scrub floors if I have to. Julian smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. It is not exactly a job, my friend. It is an agreement. There is a circle of men who have decided that they will no longer be victims of fate. We help one another, and in return, the world bows to us. Julian leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. He told Silas about a hidden grove deep within the Whispering Woods, where an old man known as the Keeper of the Dark Cycle lived. He explained that the Keeper could rewrite a man's destiny, turning his poverty into a river of riches. Silas felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard stories of such things, tales told by elders to warn children away from greed. But Silas wasn't greedy. He was drowning. He thought of the slap in the market. He thought of Lyra's empty stomach. He thought of the healer's cold demands. Show me, Silas said, his voice firming up. I cannot live like a beggar anymore. I will do whatever is necessary to save my mother. Julian nodded slowly. Meet me at the edge of the forest when the moon is half full. The days leading up to the meeting felt like years. Silas watched his mother grow weaker with every sunrise. He tried to earn more money, but the traders only laughed and offered him half pay. Even the woman who had slapped him returned to the market, mocking him as she walked past. Silas's anger grew into a hard, cold stone in his gut. He didn't tell Lyra or Mar about his plan. He told them he had found a new business partner and that things would soon change. On the night of the half moon, Silas slipped out of the hut. The forest was thick and dark, the trees looking like giant, twisted fingers reaching for the sky. He found Julian waiting by a crooked oak tree. Without a word, Julian led him deeper into the woods than Silas had ever dared to go. The air grew heavy and smelled of burnt sage and damp earth. Finally, they reached a clearing where a fire burned with blue flames. In the center sat an old man with skin like wrinkled bark and eyes that held no light. This was the Keeper. He looked at Silas and spoke in a voice that sounded like grinding stones. You seek to borrow from the future to pay for the present. Are you prepared for the interest? Silas stepped forward, his heart drumming against his ribs. I want my mother to live, he said. I want my sister to be safe. I want to never be mocked again. The Keeper laughed, a dry, rattling sound. Those are noble goals, young scholar. But the gods of the dark cycle do not give. They only trade. I can give you wealth that will make the kings of this land look like paupers. You will have palaces, carriages, and the respect of every man who once spat on you. But there are rules. These rules are the threads that hold your new life together. If you break them, the threads will snap, and the darkness will consume everything you love. Silas took a deep breath. Tell me the rules. The Keeper leaned forward, the blue fire reflecting in his hollow eyes. Rule 1. You must never help your family with this money. Not a single copper. You cannot pay their bills, buy them food, or even give them a roof over their heads. Rule 2. You must never love the same woman twice. You may have many, but your heart must remain a fortress of stone. Rule 3. You must return here once a year to pay homage. Silas's blood turned to ice. But I am doing this for them. The Keeper shook his head. That is the price of the shortcut, Silas. If you want to help them, work in the dirt for 40 years. If you want the gold now, you must accept that the gold is for you alone. The gods want your isolation, for a man with a family is a man with a weakness. Silas looked at Julian, who stood in the shadows, nodding. Julian whispered, Once you are rich, you can find other ways to help. There are loopholes, Silas. Just get the money first. Think of the 15 million for the surgery. Think of the shame. Silas's mind was a whirlwind. He thought of his mother's pale face. He thought that if he was rich, he could hire the best doctors secretly, or perhaps find a way to trick the rules later. He was a scholar, after all. Surely he was smarter than an old man in the woods. Desperation is a blind guide, and it led Silas to the edge of the cliff. I accept, he whispered. The Keeper reached out a gnarled hand and touched Silas's forehead. Silas felt a surge of heat that turned into an agonizing cold. He fell to his knees as images of gold and blood flashed before his eyes. The deal was struck. The scholar was gone. When Silas woke up the next morning, he was lying in his own bed, but everything felt different. His senses were sharper, and his heart felt heavy, as if it were made of lead. He walked outside and found a small leather bag sitting on his wooden table. Inside were 5 gold coins, each one worth more than a year of his previous labor. His heart soared. He ran into the hut to show Lyra, but as he reached for her, he remembered the keeper's words. Not a single copper. A strange, invisible force seemed to push his hand away. He tried to speak, to tell her they were rich, but his throat tightened until he couldn't make a sound. He realized with horror that the magic was not just a promise, it was a cage. He watched Lyra boiling a few scraps of yam for their mother. He had enough gold in his pocket to buy the whole village, yet he could not give her even a crumb. He walked out of the hut and went to the market. He didn't carry his table this time. He walked with his head high. He found the woman who had slapped him and bought her entire stall of spices, then ordered his servants, men who appeared as if from the shadows, to burn it to the ground. Within months, Silas became the talk of the region. He had traded his family's survival for his own glory, and the gods were keeping a strict tally of his debt. One evening, a beautiful woman named Elowen came to his mansion. She was a woman of grace and intelligence. Silas felt a spark of true affection for her, something he hadn't felt since his university days. They talked of poetry and the stars. For a moment, Silas forgot the blue fire and the cold lead in his chest. But as the night grew late, he remembered the second rule. You must never love the same woman twice. He realized that if he allowed himself to truly love Elowen, the darkness would take her too. He sat in his garden, surrounded by roses that smelled of nothing. He looked at his hands, which were soft and clean, no longer calloused from work. He had everything he had ever asked for. He had the respect he craved. When he walked through the village now, people bowed so low their foreheads touched the dust. The woman who slapped him now begged for his scraps. It was exactly what he wanted, yet it tasted like ash. He was a prisoner in a suit of gold, watching the world through a window of greed. He began to look for Julian, hoping for a way out, but Julian had vanished like smoke in the wind. The rainy season arrived with a vengeance. The skies over Elowen turned a bruised purple, and the winds howled like wounded beasts. Silas sat in his library, surrounded by books he no longer cared to read. A frantic knocking came at his massive oak doors. It was the village healer, drenched and shivering. "Lord Silas," the old man cried, "I know you have the means. Your mother, Mara, is at death's door. The tumor has moved, and she needs the surgery in the city hospital immediately. It costs 15 million. Please, have mercy on the woman who gave you life." Silas stood frozen. He had the money in a chest beneath his feet. He could pay it 10 times over without blinking. He reached for the chest, but his muscles locked. The healer left, and Silas was left alone in the silence of his wealth. He crawled to the window and looked down at the village. Through the sheets of rain, he saw a small lantern flickering in the window of the hut. He knew his mother was in there, fighting for every breath. He thought of the keeper's face and the blue fire. He realized that the dark cycle was not a circle of friends, but a circle of suffering. He had become a god of gold, but he was powerless to save a single life. He decided he would try one last thing. He called for his most trusted servant, a man who did not know of the ritual. "Take this bag of gold," Silas commanded, "and leave it on the doorstep of the hut. Do not say it is from me. Say, it is a gift from a stranger." The servant took the bag and vanished into the rain. Silas waited, his heart pounding. An hour later, the servant returned, the bag still in his hand. "I could not find the house, Lord," the man said, his eyes blank. "I walked the path a dozen times, but there was only a wall of thorns that grew higher than the trees." The gods were closing the gates. That night, Silas did not sleep. He paced his marble floors until his feet bled. At dawn, the rain stopped, leaving a heavy, suffocating mist over the valley. He heard a low, mournful wail rising from the village below. It was a sound he knew well, the sound of a family losing its heart. He didn't need his telescope to know what had happened. Mara was gone. His mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything to keep him in school, had died because of the very wealth he had sought to save her. Silas fell to his knees and let out a scream that shook the chandeliers. He had the 15 million, but he had lost the reason to spend it. He realized that the keeper had lied, or rather, Silas had lied to himself. The shortcut wasn't a path to salvation, it was a path to isolation. He had traded his mother's life for a stone mansion and a cold heart. He looked at the gold coins scattered on his floor. They looked like drops of dried blood. He wanted to throw them away, but they seemed stuck to the floor, mocking him with their permanence. He was now truly a member of the dark cycle. A week after the funeral, which Silas watched from the hill like a ghost, Lyra appeared at his gates. She was no longer the little girl he remembered. She was a woman grown old by grief in a matter of days. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for a room. She stood before him, her eyes cold and hollow. "I know it was you, Silas," she said, her voice like a jagged stone. "I saw you in the woods that night. I saw you talking to the shadows. You thought we didn't know, but the village talks. They say you sold our mother for this house. They say you are a devil in a silk shirt." Silas tried to explain, but the words died in his throat. He couldn't tell her about the rules. He couldn't tell her he was a prisoner. To her, he was simply a brother who had chosen gold over blood. "I hope you are happy," she whispered. "I hope the walls of this house keep you warm, for you have no sister anymore. You are dead to me." She turned and walked away, and as she did, a wall of thick, black thorns sprouted from the earth, separating the mansion from the village forever. The years began to blur into a gray fog of luxury and despair. Silas grew richer and richer. Every business he touched turned to gold. He owned ships, mines, and banks. But he lived alone in his fortress of thorns. He followed the second rule strictly. He had many women, but he never spoke their names twice. He treated them like shadows, and they left him as soon as the sun rose. He became known as the Ice Lord. People feared him more than they respected him. Once a year, he returned to the clearing in the forest. The blue fire still burned, and the keeper still sat in the center. "You're doing well, Silas," the old man would say. "The debt is being paid in full." Silas would stand in the silence, feeling the coldness in his soul growing deeper. He asked about Julian once. The keeper only laughed. "Julian?" He reached the end of his cycle. The darkness called, and he answered. "Soon, it will be your turn to host the gathering." Silas didn't understand what that meant, but he knew it wasn't a reward. He was a branch on a dying tree, waiting for the wind to break him. One afternoon, Silas received a letter. It was written on cheap, yellowed paper, and the handwriting was shaky. It was from Lyra. She told him that she had stayed in the village, working as a laundress to survive. She had married a poor but kind farmer, and they had a small son. But the son was sick with the same fever that had taken their mother. She wasn't asking for gold. She was asking for him to come and see the boy. "He looks like you," she wrote. "He has your eyes. Perhaps if you see him, you will remember who you were before the gold." Silas felt a flicker of warmth in his chest. He wanted to go. He ordered his carriage to be readied. But as he stepped outside, the thorns around his mansion grew into a massive, tangled mess. The horses refused to move, their eyes rolling in terror. Silas tried to walk, but the ground beneath his feet turned into a swamp of black mud. He realized the gods would not even let him be a spectator to his family's life. He was a star that had been removed from the sky, destined to shine alone in the void. Desperate to help his nephew, Silas came up with a plan. He would hire a famous doctor from the capital and pay him a fortune to go to the village and treat the boy. He would tell the doctor it was a mission of charity from the hospital, not from him. He spent 1,000,000 gold coins to arrange everything. He watched through his telescope as the doctor's carriage approached the village. He felt a moment of hope. But as the carriage reached the edge of Elowen, a sudden, freak storm blew in. Lightning struck the path, and a giant tree fell. crushing the carriage and killing the doctor. Silas fell to his floors, sobbing. The keeper's words echoed in his mind. Not a single copper, directly or indirectly. The gods were not just watching his actions, they were watching his intent. Every time he tried to do good with the dirty money, the darkness intervened with a tragedy. He was a man who could buy the world, but he couldn't buy a single day of health for a child. He realized his wealth was a curse that infected everything it touched. Silas began to lose his mind. He would walk through his mansion, talking to the portraits of his mother and sister. He would scream at the walls, offering to give up every coin for 1 hour of peace. But the walls only echoed his own voice. He stopped eating fine foods and began to eat only dry bread and water, hoping to trick the gods. But the bread would turn to honey and the water to wine in his mouth. He was forced to live in luxury, a punishment for his greed. One night, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the thorns. It was a man, thin and ragged, with eyes that burned with a familiar light. It was Julian. But Julian was no longer the wealthy man in the leather boots. He was a hollow shell of a person. "Silas," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "The cycle is ending. They are coming for the host. You must run, though there is nowhere to go." Before Silas could ask a question, Julian collapsed, his body turning into a pile of black ash that the wind scattered into the night. The Ice Lord felt the first real fear he had known in years. The next day was the anniversary of the ritual. Silas knew he had to return to the woods. He didn't want to go, but his legs moved on their own, walking him down the hill and into the shadows. The clearing was different this time. There were 12 men standing around the blue fire, all dressed in black. They were the other members of the Dark Cycle. They were the richest men in the land, yet their faces were masks of pure agony. The keeper stood in the center, his eyes glowing with a fierce, hungry light. "Welcome, Lord Silas," he said. "Tonight, you host the Feast of Shadows. You have been our most successful member. Your wealth has grown 10,000-fold. But tonight, the gods demand their final payment. They do not want your gold anymore. They want your legacy." Silas looked at the other men. He saw their empty eyes and their trembling hands. He realized they were all like him, men who had traded their souls for a shortcut. "What legacy?" Silas asked, his voice trembling. "I have no one. My mother is dead. My sister hates me. My nephew is sick. I have nothing but this gold." The keeper smiled. "Exactly. You have become the gold. And tonight, the gold returns to the earth." The ritual began. The 12 men started to chant in a language that sounded like the hissing of snakes. The blue fire rose higher and higher, turning into a pillar of flame that reached the treetops. Silas felt his body becoming light, as if he were turning into smoke. He saw images of his life flashing before him. His mother's smile, the slap in the market, the look in Lyra's eyes. He realized that the gold had never been his. He had only been a vessel for the darkness to grow. The keeper stepped toward him, holding a golden dagger. "To end the cycle, the host must give everything back," the old man said. "But not to the poor, not to the needy. You must give it back to the fire." Silas looked at the fire and saw the faces of all the people he had hurt or ignored. He saw the woman from the market, his mother, and his sister. He realized that the only way to save Lyra and her son was to break the cycle entirely. But the keeper had said there was no going back. Silas looked at the dagger, and then at the flames. He realized he had one choice left. He could die a prisoner, or he could die a sacrifice. In a moment of clarity, Silas grabbed the golden dagger from the keeper's hand. He didn't turn it on the old man. Instead, he turned it on himself. He realized that the rules only applied as long as he was the owner of the wealth. If he died, the contract would be void. But he didn't want to just die. He wanted to destroy the treasure. He stabbed the dagger into the ground at the center of the blue fire. A massive explosion of light and sound knocked the 12 men back. The earth began to crack open, and the mansion on the hill began to crumble into a pile of dust. Silas felt the lead in his chest melting away. He saw the thorns around the village vanishing. He heard the voice of his mother, soft and warm, calling his name. The gold in his pockets turned to simple pebbles. The silks on his back turned to the rough cotton of a scholar's shirt. He was no longer a lord. He was just Silas. But the darkness was not finished with him. The crack in the earth began to pull him in, a final price for his interference. Silas struggled against the pull of the earth. He looked up and saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was Lyra. She had followed him into the woods, driven by a strange intuition. She saw her brother hanging over the abyss, his face pale and exhausted. For a moment, she hesitated. She remembered the thorns and the mockery. She remembered their mother's silent death. But then she saw the pebbles in his hand and the old shirt he wore. She saw the brother who had once carried her on his back through the rain. She ran forward and grabbed his hand. "Silas, hold on," she screamed. The keeper tried to stop her, but the blue fire was dying, and his power was fading with it. The 12 men fled into the darkness, leaving their wealth behind as ash. Lyra pulled with all her strength, her love proving stronger than the gods' greed. With a final burst of energy, she pulled Silas onto the solid ground just as the clearing swallowed itself whole, leaving nothing but a circle of scorched earth. The dark cycle was broken. Silas lay on the ground, breathing in the scent of damp leaves and fresh air. He was poor again. He had nothing but the clothes on his back. His mansion was gone, his ships had sunk, and his banks had vanished. But the lead in his chest was gone. He looked at Lyra and saw that she was crying. "The boy," he whispered. "Is he?" Lyra nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. "The fever broke an hour ago." It was like a weight was lifted from the house. Silas wept then, not for his lost gold, but for the mercy he didn't deserve. He realized that the shortcut had taken years of his life and his mother's breath, but it had not taken his soul entirely. He walked back to the village with Lyra. The people didn't bow to him anymore. Some looked at him with suspicion, others with pity. He didn't care. He went to his mother's grave and sat there for a long time, telling her everything. He promised her that he would spend the rest of his life working in the light. No matter how hard the path, Silas returned to his small wooden table in the market. He was older now, his hair tinged with gray, but his eyes were bright. He became a teacher, showing the village children that knowledge is a tool, not a weapon. He taught them that wealth without a shadow is a cage, and that the only true gold is the love of a family. Lyra's son grew up healthy and strong, and he often sat by Silas's side as he told stories of the boy who wanted to be a king and found he was better as a man. The village of Elowen grew prosperous, not through magic, but through hard work and kindness. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is half full, the elders tell the story of the harvest of silent tears. They warn the young ones to never listen to the whispers of the whispering woods. For the darkness gives you everything you ask for, but it takes away everything you actually need. Silas lived to be an old man, and when he finally closed his eyes for the last time, he did so with a full heart and empty pockets, finally free of the debt. If you were in Silas's shoes, standing in that market after being humiliated, with a dying mother at home, would you have walked into the whispering woods, or would you have stayed in the dirt? Be honest, is a clean heart worth more than a mother's life? Let me know in the comments.